much. I'm very excited about this conference. As mentioned earlier, there's some great speakers. I know a lot of them, and they've got some great things to talk about. And I'm hoping that you enjoy day 2 of the conference just as much as you enjoyed day 1. So as mentioned, we're talking a little bit about the new role of the Agile tester. And specifically what we're going to talk about here for the next 45 minutes or so is the quality engineer role. And we're going to use the construction project analogy. I'm making the assumption that everybody has either participated in or knows about a general kind of building or house construction project. And we're going to talk a little bit about and use that analogy and see the differences between QA and QE. And then we're going to talk about what the modern testing role looks like and spend a little time on what I believe is one of the game changers in really communicating and getting the message or evangelizing the role of the modern tester out by using the modernized definition of done. You probably have heard that terminology, that term definition of done, if you are practicing or transforming into some sort of an Agile methodology. And then we're going to see this at work. What does it actually look like to use this modern type of testing role, the quality engineer, on a very, probably very well-known type of testing practice or service around regression testing. And then also applying it to scripted versus unscripted testing. So let's talk a little bit about the quality engineer role, because before I start, I want to make sure that we're all on the same page. By the way, quality engineer is not a term that I've defined or made up. It's been out there for a while. But I do like to first talk about some of the misperceptions around the quality engineer, around the quality assurance role, and why the role of the quality engineer is so important. So let's talk a little bit about the misperceptions of quality assurance. You may have experienced this in previous companies or previous roles that you've played, or you may be experiencing these misperceptions now. So let's go through those a little bit. So first of all, one of the misperceptions of quality assurance is that there is one team only that owns quality. I mean, why not? Generally speaking, our title or our role actually includes the word quality in there, whether it's quality assurance or quality engineering. And sometimes the misperception is that because that team or that title has that word quality in there, that they're the only team that owns quality. Another misperception is that it's not a skill. Testing or quality assurance is not a skill. And for example, anyone who is a user can test, or anyone that may have been an expert in the software from a user side or a business side, or in a non-tester side, that the skill set really does not exist, so that anybody that has familiarity with the software can automatically become a quality assurance or a tester. One of the probably the most frustrating misperceptions of quality assurance is that if an issue is found by live or in production or by a user, because QA has generally been one of the last teams to have looked at that code before releasing, that those issues are automatically the fault of QA when a user finds those issues outside of that. So it's easy to kind of point the finger at that quality assurance person if bugs happen to escape. And we know that software is inherently going to have issues in there. It is not necessarily the job or the role of QA to find every single bug, but it is more important to have those conversations and to be able to collaborate with our teammates when those issues wind up escaping and inadvertently get rolled out into production. Other misperceptions of quality assurance that we're the mistake finders, right? So if you have a very kind of systemic or serial way of delivering software, mistakes that may have been introduced within the SDLC early on, such as around requirements gathering or building of stories or proper acceptance criterion stories, a lot of times mistakes will compound and go through different levels of or different teams, starting from a product owner or business analyst all the way through development and others. But again, going back to the one of the original statements, which is generally because QA in these situations are one of, if not the last teams to look at that code, a lot of times the mistake finders wind up really kind of gathering a lot of speed and a lot of weight towards the end of that cycle. And then when mistakes are found, a lot of that pressure or responsibility is perceived to be the role of the quality assurance person on that team. We also kind of become that catch-off for failed processes in the same way that we may find mistakes and we may share that in part of our information gathering and sharing out to our project team members and counterparts. We may wind up becoming part of the catch-off for failed processes as well. And then probably one of the other misperceptions that a lot of individuals or even teams within companies that we find that one of the biggest misperceptions is that the QA team is the only team that is doing any type of testing, right? So when we think about those misperceptions that quality assurance may have or is currently introducing to the SDLC and to perhaps your company or organization, the quality engineering role really seeks to bust those misperceptions. So let's talk a little bit about when I say quality engineer, here is how I define that. And again, this is very industry aligned very much with our industry of how other industry thought leaders would define a quality engineering role. But I wanted to just make sure that we were all aligned. When I say quality engineering role, here's really what I mean. So it's not simply just replacing the term assurance with engineer and then presto, we have a brand new role. There really is a lot of deliberate definition around that. So I like to use the engineering definition and apply it to the quality engineering role. So for most professional engineers, there is these 6 components and characteristics of what makes a quality engineer. So we define a solution, we design and build that solution, we ultimately execute that solution, we measure that solution, and we report on that. So when we define that, we are talking about how do we define success? What does success mean? And is everyone on the project team or the Agile team aligned with what success means? We also define what we believe will be the outcome when we're thinking about whether we're documenting a formal test strategy or test plan, or when we're actually strategizing, we're defining those and we come up with hypotheses. And then we come in and we may actually certify that hypothesis is correct or that behavior that we expected is correct. But more importantly, we measure that. And then, of course, we design that comprehensive strategy, again, whether it is a document that is more of a formal strategy, or if it's the process of putting a strategy together and executing that, we're designing that strategy by taking all of that information that we are gathering, both implicit and explicit information, and we are putting together that comprehensive strategy so that we can ultimately build that solution based off of the 2 other components in front of that. And then, of course, we execute that solution. And whether that is executing test cases or from a manual standpoint, whether we are executing automated test scripts or whether we're performing exploratory or non-scripted testing, we're executing that solution that we designed and built previously. And then, of course, we're measuring those results. How far off or how close were we when we were hypothesizing around how that software would actually function in the real world? So we're measuring those results. And then we're also reporting the outcome. But more importantly, not just simply reporting the outcome of the testing, but we're reporting on the information that we are constantly gathering throughout all of those phases of the SDLC. So the best way that I can really kind of quote the quality engineering role, other than those 6 components previously, is really by this quote. When you know that you are functioning as a quality engineer, when you are able to influence the building of the software before the software is built. So before that first line of code is built, the quality engineer is really very consultative with our developers, with our product owners, with anyone that is a pillar or a representative on our Agile or our project team. And this quote really is the end all be all outcome of when do you know that you are functioning as a quality engineer. And one of the 2 most important characteristics that a quality engineer can have is that we balance both technical acumen and user advocacy, and we put equal emphasis on both, which means that we become context driven. And if you're not familiar with that term, the way that I define it, and again, this is not a term that I've defined. There are many other thought leaders that have defined context driven many, many years ago. But the way that I like to define the context driven concept is that given the information that we have, we determine if that information is enough. And if not, we find more information. So it's not simply enough to rely on explicit information like requirements or user stories or acceptance criteria within those user stories. That is going to be very important information for us to use. But ultimately, we have the ability to determine whether or not information that is presented to us and that's centralized to us is enough. And if it's not, we have the ability to go find more. So going back to kind of that comparison of a construction project again. So when we think about the typical roles on a construction project, a building or a house project or something like that, they're pretty typical roles. So as I go through these roles, I'd like for you to kind of think about which one is typically considered the QA role when we use that analogy. So we have an architect, we have skilled tradespeople, electricians, painters, plumbers, people that have very specific skills and expertise within areas that are very important for that. We have a general contractor. We have a project manager in some cases. Some cases, they may be small enough where you might not need a project manager. We have ultimately the building inspector, the one that comes in and says, okay, did you do what you said you're going to do? And does it apply or does it actually conform to code? And then, of course, we have the customer. So when we think about which one has typically of these 6 different characteristics or roles within a construction project, we tend to think of that role of QA as being that building inspector, right? And so when we think about misperceptions of the quality assurance or QA as the inspector, things that really we've done a disservice using that analogy is number one, it instills a false sense of non-ownership within development, right? So if QA is put into that role of assuring that other roles and people within the project team did what they were supposed to do, and we're going to come in and check that they did what they were supposed to do, that really takes some of the ownership and onus from, say, a developer or a product owner, where they're no longer responsible for doing their own checks because there's now this big team called quality assurance that is going to do that for them. It also kind of assumes that other people on the team cannot be trusted to check their own work. I've had so many conversations over the years where in cases where the developers may have made mistakes, which, by the way, we all make mistakes, and the ability to recover from those mistakes and learn from them in and of itself is an extremely valuable activity within any kind of work, but specifically SDLC and coding and testing of code that's eventually going to be consumed by users. But when we put QA in the role of the inspector, it assumes that other team members can't be trusted to check their own work because now there's this team that will make sure that they did the work that they were supposed to. And that ultimately results in this us versus them mentality. You may be currently experiencing this. I know that many companies and organizations still have a lot of tension between the QA team and the developers team. And that us versus them mentality ultimately creates QA as a crutch. So when we think about using now, moving the quality engineer, in my opinion, as that general contractor role, here's what that looks like generally from a high level. So generally speaking, QE professionals are familiar with multiple components of the software development lifecycle. We may not be a plumber or an electrician, but we definitely know enough about that to be able to be, in some cases, consultative, but at least we have a general understanding of multiple, if not all, components of the SDLC. We also should or will or do currently work with the owner, so to speak, in that construction project analogy, or in this case, the user, whether that's the user themselves and customers, if we have direct lines with them, or if it's for those user advocates. In some cases, it might be a business analyst or a product manager or a product owner who is advocating for the user in those situations. But QE generally has to understand not only the functional requirements of what we're testing, but also the user's experience and advocate, again, on behalf of that user. And QE really comes in because we can vet out requirements and specific needs of that user. So when we start thinking about the misperception of that QA as the inspector role and move more into QE as the general contractor role, we can start seeing how QE can become more consultative, and going back to that quote a few slides ago, that we are influential in the building of the software before that software is actually built. So, like the general contractor on a construction project, we can advocate that the desired level of quality has been met, including design and the user experience. And during that time, we are offering timely and valuable feedback to the tradespeople, or in this case, our developers or people who are actively contributing or influencing code that add to the overall success of the project. So how does this look? What is the modern approach of a quality engineer? We're early adopters and embracers of technology. We are technologists at the end of the day. We're curious. Not only do we ask, how is this supposed to work, which should be pretty vetted out in requirements and acceptance criteria, but more importantly, what happens if I do this? So that curiosity really allows us to kind of take and navigate within the software in ways that the software may not have been built, but we're able to provide that information. And one of the funniest things, and if you've been in testing or quality assurance or quality engineering for as long as I have, or maybe close to as long as I have, I tend to think of that old school interview question that you may have been asked, why do you like testing? And a lot of times, a lot of us would answer because I like to break things, right? And so we've tended to draw away from a little bit from that. But I really like to think about that as one of the key characteristics as well, is that we're looking at areas of where the software might break, so to speak, so that we can advocate on behalf of our users to ensure that their experience is not only going to be fine, but it's also going to be delightful and it's going to be accurate. We think like a user, and we therefore act like a user as well. So we're looking at continuous improvement. The modern approach always looks at ways to continuously improve. We ask, why do we do this? But more importantly, what happens if we stop? One of the biggest examples I can use with that is when, for those of you who may be required to create, say, a separate test plan document that might be have to be approved and reviewed by a lot of stakeholders. So whenever I go into companies and I ask about what kinds of documentation that they are required to produce, one of the big ones is a test plan. And there's absolute value in test plans, especially in highly regulated industries where you may have a third party or there may be some sort of certification that happens in there and you have to produce this document. But most of the time, if you're not in one of those industries that's highly regulated, where there is a definite need and it is well known of why a test plan document is needed, I like to ask, why do we do this? Why do we provide a test plan? And usually we can answer that. Well, so-and-so stakeholders likes to read it, or it's part of the checklist of items that we have to do. And that's a great question to ask. Why do we do this? But more importantly, what happens if we stop? So if we can apply that, what happens if we stop question to perhaps outdated documents simply because they've been done for many years, that really tends to drive what I think is an ultimate outcome. Because if you can't answer specifically, well, what happens if we stop doing this, and there's no real reason, then that might actually turn the tables so that you don't need to produce documentation simply for documentation's sake. We always want to make sure that the activities that we're participating in, whether it's actual testing or preparing for testing or reporting on findings, we always want to make sure that those are providing the maximum value throughout while we're collaborating with our team members. The modern QE also strikes a balance between those traditional specialist roles, and we move towards being taking some or all aspects or components of those traditional specialist roles, and we pull them into the more generalist quality engineering role. Some of those traditional specialist roles look like test automation, accessibility engineering, functional security testing. And when I say functional security, I do want to make sure that we're not talking about the heavy duty kind of white hat AppSec penetration testing, testing in there. So we're pulling out some aspects of functional security testing and performance testing, right? And so these have generally been considered more traditional specialist roles. It might sound familiar for you as a tester that, okay, I'm going to write these test cases, I'm going to execute these test cases, and then I'm going to mark these test cases as needing to be automated. And then further down the line, an automation engineer will come in and they will look at those test cases that you've marked to be automated, and then they'll go ahead and automate them, right? And the same thing with accessibility. Well, I don't have any skill sets to do accessibility testing, so we have a third party and we're going to farm out all the accessibility testing to those. So these are generally considered traditional specialist roles, but the modern quality engineer pulls in aspects of all of those roles, all four of these roles and many others. These are just 4 examples. And we see which can we actually pull into that more generalist quality engineer role. So how do we do it? We've kind of commandeered the definition of done. And so if you're currently practicing Agile right now, the definition of done generally has been kind of always owned by, say, the product management or product owner, pillar or representation within the SDLC. I think that there's so much value in understanding what done means and having that centralized and available to the rest of the team. And really the way that we've kind of commandeered and redefined that is that we really just simply call it the playbook for how we do testing. And we tie it to the columns in our project management tool, whether it's Jira or something similar. But when we have cards or stories or tickets in a specific column of testing, the idea of this playbook of definition of done means that we can actually have a very consistent entry and exit criteria of that column, and it's very well known and centralized to the rest of the project team. I have a lot of information on the definition of done, and I'm happy to share more follow-up questions on what the definition of done really means, and show you how it works for another talk. So feel free to reach out to me. So now what does this look like in the real world, right? So we talked about the high level misperceptions of quality assurance, and maybe you're experiencing some or all of those. And now we come back in and say the modern general contractor role of quality engineering comes in and replaces and answers those misperceptions. But now what does it really look like? So I'm just going to talk quickly through two areas that we all have experienced or currently experience. Number one is the misperceptions of regression testing, right? And so QA owns that solely. We are the only team that is responsible for ensuring that we have not regressed in our code. We build in days or sometimes weeks to account for this very big, large regression testing cycle. And it's usually at the end of the sprint, right? And so we've gotten to dev complete for all of our stories, all of the work that is responsible for that sprint or for that cycle of work, or if you're using Kanban for that particular card. And we usually say, okay, dev complete, it's now QA complete, and now we move into this big regression cycle. And that's going to take a few days, or it might take a few weeks before, as we prepare to release this big kind of large chunks of code into production. And then we kind of push that towards the end of the release. So when we think about applying that modern QE general contractor role to a particular service like regression testing, we shift left within the sprint, right? And so instead of having that regression cycle wait until the end after we're code complete and, for days and weeks before we release to production, we shift that left. And ideally, it is within a couple of days from that development. And we shift that in some cases to development, to just say that QA is the only team that is responsible for ensuring that there are no regressions that have been introduced with coding is, quite honest, a very short-sighted opinion. The developers, and really good developers, should want to be very engaged and to also assure that they have not regressed in their coding. So we want to make sure that we are always engaging them with our regression testing. And if we wait until the very end of a cycle or while preparing for a release, generally speaking, when a dev is complete with a story, they're going to move on to the next sprint or the next release worth of work. So they're probably paying attention to regression testing, but they're not as engaged as they need to, because there are days and weeks of time where they could be working on something else. We're gathering that information real time, and we're sharing that while the code is fresh in the mind of the developer, which is why I tend to use that 2 to 3 days from a developer releasing that code to us. We want to make sure that we are giving that developer very quick feedback on regression, and ideally providing them automated tests that they can run on their own that shifts that big, heavy regression cycle all the way from the right to the left to the developer. So that's how it looks like from a modern regression testing way. Let's look at another example, scripted versus unscripted testing, right? And so when we tend to, when a story comes our way and that code has been deployed into our QA environment, one of the first things that we tend to do as testers is that we tend to either check that the acceptance criteria has been met, and we just kind of simply walk through that if it hasn't already been demoed to us from development before. And probably the next activity that we do is we start running the non-automated manual test cases for that story, right? And so none of that is a bad behavior or bad actions, but what I would like to start introducing, the more modern way of looking at scripted versus unscripted testing, is that we start first with exploring that story, unscripted testing on that story. And so we fight the urge to run those, again, non-automated test cases first, and we actually start with exploring. And ideally, those scripted tests, both automated and non-automated, have been written before and during the coding of the story. So by the time that story comes to the quality engineering team, we have already had those tests created, and they're ready to be executed. But more importantly, we have written those tests while that coding, either before the coding is started or during the coding of the story. And ideally, good developers are going to be looking at those tests while they're coding so that they can write the code to be able to pass those tests. So if you use that model and approach where those tests are written before we actually start testing, or a good majority of those tests are written before we actually get that story to us, we can start with exploring, because as you know, exploratory testing is going to find the most bugs. And in some cases, it's going to find the most important and critical bugs early on. So we start shifting a lot of that exploratory testing, which tends to happen after we have executed all of the scripted tests, whether, again, automated or non-automated. And we are going to flip that around and actually start exploring that story first so that we can use the brand new eyes and new sets of testing to give that most important and critical information back to the developer while that code is still fresh in their mind. So the construction project analogy, QA versus QE. QA as the inspector has been kind of the traditional old school way of thinking about the role of quality assurance on a team. And we are now replacing that with the modern quality engineering role, much like the general contractor of a construction project. Talk about what the modern testing role looks like. We defined that role, and we talked about two specific areas, regression testing and unscripted testing, of where those apply within your SDLC as real life practices, something that you can do tomorrow or next week and start thinking like a quality engineer, even if your title or role does not actually say quality engineering role in there. We use that modernized definition of done, and we really look at it as a playbook. We build that consistency in to say, and we kind of use those terminologies that traditionally we've used as entry and exit criteria, and we apply those to the columns where work is being seen and centralized for the project team. So we say, here are the things that we expect from our developers before this work comes in. We want to see unit tests. We want to see that there have been checks and code reviews that are done. And then we also apply that same concept to when we move a ticket out of that QA or in testing column or in progress column, whatever that looks like in your world. Here are the things that we promise and engage to do before we say that testing is complete and we move that card out of that column to the next column. And then we applied it to, again, those two specific services and activities that all of us tend to do, which is regression testing. Shift that from the right to the left as much as possible while the code is fresh in the developer's mind, and give them the tests, whether they execute those tests themselves or whether you are providing those tests while they're coding. Give them the advantage and the opportunity to review those tests and build those into their coding. So when they do that, you know that code is now is validating those tests that we've provided, so that you can spend your time on more of those highly important and valuable activities like unscripted exploratory testing. So with that said, here's my contact information, and I think I'll kind of open it up for questions. All right. Okay.
Can you see the questions, Melissa? It's Q&A tab.
Let's see. I can't see them yet, but let me see. Which
on the right.
Right here. Oh.
Oh.
Okay. I don't see any questions yet.
Okay. So
I just got one. Okay. Can I elaborate further on shift left with automation testing? Is it possible? Absolutely. Another talk that I give is really emphasizing the shippable component or terminology. So a lot of times in the definition of done that I was alluding to and kind of walking through, and again, I'm happy to share, modern actual definitions of done that I've used in present and other companies here. But the idea is that automation should absolutely be part of the completion of the story. We tend to say, okay, a story is dev complete, and then it moves into QA complete. And we tend to just define QA as we've executed these test cases, and the QA person or that tester says, we've tested this enough, and we're going to move it down. And then further down the line, whether it's days or sprints behind, we come back in and we automate. So I am not a fan of simply automating off of test cases. I believe that a modern quality engineer who has test automation experience should actually be consultative in talking about what will be automated as part of that story. I have a kind of a key priorities of things that I tend to roll out when we're either building out or modernizing a test automation strategy. I will say that, if you tie automation at least to the automation of a smoke test and the acceptance criteria of that story, you can actually tie the automation to being shippable and complete versus waiting until maybe the code has been deployed and then coming back around and doing it. So the tying of that quality engineer role before that code is starting to be built, and while we're refining and grooming that work, we actually talk about that automation and what will be there, and then we actually don't deploy that code. We don't consider that story complete in fully complete until that automation is not only complete, but it's also running green and ideally in the pipeline. And that's the way that you build in that regression testing early on. And then that automation of that story becomes the regression testing, or at least a percentage of the regression testing early on. And it is available to the developers that they can run that if and when they're touching that code for the next round or the next sprint. But also it begins the first layers and building blocks of a full regression suite. Let's see.
Right. You have a couple of more questions under the Q&A tab.
Yep. So I see one here. There's one, if there's more than one team working on the same project, is it okay to have more than one definition of done? I would say, I think that there are some components that I should be shared amongst all teams. At some point, there should be kind of a top 10 list of things that, regardless of which team is working on that, that they should be able to consistently align with a general and agreed upon definition of done. So I do think that there is some ability to have differences in definition of done, but there are core characteristics of definition of done that should be maintained for every team that is practicing testing or quality engineering in this case. But then as different teams are unique among themselves, there may be additions that are added to be able to support individual unique teams. But I tend to say that that consistent definition of done that is used by all teams really is the better way to approach a definition of done.